Welcome, everybody. This talk is going to be on pH and sleep and the connection between them. And I'm not sure where this is going to be posted, but if you're watching this after the fact, you already know that. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that'll be part of this, and I'll pause it in a couple of places to allow people to ask questions, and I encourage you to ask questions. If you'd like me to pause the recording, please just ask me to do that, and so that you and your voice and the question don't necessarily get recorded, but my answer does get recorded. Any questions before we start the presentation? Okay. At any time you do need to ask a question, just unmute yourself. That will bring you to the top of my participant screen, and I'll be able to see you there. Otherwise, you can raise your hand, and that will also bring you to my attention. Okay, got the presentation loaded and ready to go. So let's start with some basics. pH balancing is not something that your doctor is going to talk to you about. Most doctors are not trained in this kind of phenomena, and their awareness of pH effects are pretty much limited to severe pH conditions, where acidosis and alkalosis kinds of conditions. And it turns out that it's not like that's not going to happen, but there are more subtle aspects of pH that are involved in everyday life. And so I describe it as a tide. It's hardwired into all the animals that are alive today and that were alive going back. So you can look at it in the most primitive kinds of animals. And it's an essential aspect of health and well-being. So we have an acid tide during the day, and we have an alkaline tide at night. And so if you're monitoring your urine pH, at some point during the night, either before you go to bed at night, in the middle of the night, if you wake up in the middle of the night, or at the end of the night when you wake up in the morning, you will see your urine go alkaline at roughly a pH 7. And I'll show a bunch of diagrams of what this kind of stuff looks like when you see it graphed out. And I'll also show you what a sleep pH tracking chart looks like. But just understand that pH is not a static commodity. So when you look at the pH at the cellular level, you find that it's fairly moderately controlled, 1/10 of a pH unit. And remember, a pH unit is a factor of 10 in terms of actual proton concentrations. But when you look at cancer tissues, you find that it's shifted from the normal pH by a minimum of 1, if not even 2 full pH units. So there's a big disturbance in pH that's associated with cancer. And some cancers are associated with an alkaline cellular pH trend, and others are associated with an acidic pH trend. But it's present in all cancers. Blood pH is tightly controlled. And so while normal pH of cells might vary by 1/10 of a pH unit, blood is much more tightly controlled than that. And it's in hundreds of pH units. And it turns out this is very important for one of the most basic aspects of respiratory physiology, which is how hemoglobin pumps oxygen into the body and pumps carbon dioxide out of the body. we have two different kinds of acid that get generated by our metabolism, and carbon dioxide is from aerobic metabolism, and lactic acid is from anaerobic metabolism. And it turns out that this is very much an experiential phenomenon. Carbon dioxide diffuses easily. It's really easy to get rid of that kind of alkalinity or acidity to balance the body's alkalinity. But lactic acid doesn't diffuse gracefully. It tends to build up in the tissues. And anybody who's done peak performance exercise while they're out of shape, might be a good way to say it, can feel that lactic acid burn as an experience. So there's a balance between the acid and alkalinity of the body and the acid and alkalinity of the diet. And so the energy systems of the body only produce acid. And our diets are primarily alkaline in terms of plant matters, for example. That side of our diet is very dominantly alkaline. There are a few things like grain and nuts that are acidifying and meats that can be acidifying, but on the whole, the bulk of the typical human diet is alkalinizing. And alkaline diet combined with high energy metabolism is balancing. So you just have two opposite effects that are inviting, and some people who are extremely healthy can eat a very, very alkaline diet and their energy systems come up to match, and those people are quite energetic and vital. But when you have somebody whose energy systems are compromised and their ability to generate carbon dioxide or lactic acid are compromised, when you put alkali into the diet, the alkali stress isn't matched. There isn't a capacity to increase energy to match it, and you end up with pathology. And I describe it as the crash and burn thing, and it's not as well known as might be because a lot of the people who promote alkaline-based diets and plant-based diets tend to exclude the people who have a bad reaction. So it's kind of an ostracism effect, and so they often do not acknowledge the degree to which an alkaline diet can become pathological. Acidic foods can compensate for a low energy opportunity by adding acid to balance alkalinity through dietary things, nutrients. I have a list of those. But when you mix acidic diet with an anaerobic imbalance, where energy is being generated through lactic acid, you get severe pathology, and that's the acidic American stereotype. So that's why acid has or acidity has the popular reputation as being bad, and alkalinity has a popular reputation as being good, and those are just stereotype generalizations. So we have basically two systems that are defending blood pH to keep it tightly controlled so that hemoglobin works the way it's supposed to. And the blood buffering system is passive and slow, and the kidneys are active and fast. And so those systems, you can observe them in a variety of ways, but it's the buffering is very difficult to measure. There's too many blood buffering systems in there, but when those fail, you end up with a clinical pathology and likely get diagnosed by a doctor. The kidneys, on the other hand, handle pH very, very rapidly, and that's why looking at urine can be so valuable. So the kidneys basically pump the excess acid entering the blood out, or they conserve acidity when the body is alkaline, when the acid is in short supply. And so the stresses to the blood show up as swings in acid and alkaline values in the urine. That's why it makes it very a nice thing to measure. And so this is the hemoglobin phenomena that happens at about 4/100ths of a pH unit variation between the deep tissues and the lungs, and this pH gradient is essential for our health and well-being. I'll go into that more in a minute. This is what it looks like. If you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see my cursor, but there's a circulation issue going on here in the blood. So the blood flows from the lungs into the tissues of the body. There's a pH change, an acidic pH shift that hinges the hemoglobin protein to drive off the oxygen so that the tissues can absorb it, and correspondingly open it up for absorbing carbon dioxide. The blood then flows back to the lungs where it hinges the opposite direction, which absorbs the oxygen and drives off the CO2. It's a very, very elegant nanomachine. So this is what a pH pattern might look like. If you're charting it over time, we have the time of day at the bottom, going from morning to evening, back to morning again. The average 6.0, 6.2, it's not really that critical for that subtle difference, but it gives you a point of measurement, and you will see that the green line, which represents the ideal or schematic version of it, oscillates between 7, which is 10 times less acidity than average, to pH 5, which is 10 times more acidity than average. So this is kind of what it looks like. And the gray line is what you would see as an example of what you might see when you're measuring your own pH in real life. So you're not seeing the smoothness of the curve, you're seeing it being jagged because you're not peeing continuously, you're only peeing intermittently. And that urine that's being collected is averaging its pH during that period of time when you measure it. So when you look at the pH readings in the early part of the morning, if you've been storing up urine all night, so you urinate before you go to bed at night, and then you urinate when you wake up in the morning, assuming you don't wake up, then you're going to have to see the first and second urinations of the morning to project backwards to see what the pH might have been during the night. The closer together your points are, the more smoothness and the more diagnostic power your urine pH tracking has for you. So sleep and awake are intrinsically metabolically dependent, and that affects itself in a variety of ways in people. We have an acid tide that indicates a raised basal metabolic rate, and that's when your immunity needs to be optimized for your survival. During the day when you're moving around and you might get scratched by plants or bitten by an animal, you want to have your immunity being as efficient as possible. And at night you get a lower basal metabolic rate, and that's where your repair and healing processes take place. And this is a essential aspect of optimum survival for animals. So if you have a sleep problem, you can look at this as a potential cause. And then if you identify that there's something going wrong, you have a potential for intervening at a level other than drugs, nutrients, herbs, and things like that. The morning lark and the night owl are common manifestations of this. So these would be examples of shifts in pH pattern that I would consider fundamentally not pathological. Most people in the world will tend to drift one way or the other. The orange lark line is shifted earlier in the day, which means they wake up with acid momentum. Their body is already starting to dump the alkaline dominance at night and is acidifying for the day. And so they can, because they already have acid momentum, they can eat an alkaline breakfast like fruit, for example, or a salad, and it doesn't mess with them because their acid momentum is already going, and that balances out the alkalinity of their diet. And that can actually be an advantage in, for example, extending their circadian rhythm. So larks would have at the most severe end a tendency to drift um, um, earlier in time and wake up earlier and earlier and go to bed earlier and earlier. And if they eat an alkalinizing breakfast, that will extend their circadian rhythm and tend to keep them synchronized into a 24-hour cycle, which then might allow them to not require an alarm clock. The night owl variation is very, very similar, only it's shifted later. And the biological clock is more than 24 hours. For most people, it is a bit more, 24 and a half hours. But for night owls, it tends to be a 25-hour clock, which means the night owls are at the greatest risk for staying up later and later and then skipping a day. So that's kind of a dyssynchrony that's quite strong. And I experienced that myself when I was a college student. They wake up slowly, and if their spouse demands morning exercise, that's grounds for divorce. Typically, morning larks like to exercise in the morning, and night owls like to exercise in the afternoon or the evening. And if night owls eat an alkaline breakfast, it derails them for the entire day because it prevents them from acidifying. They're late to acidify, and it delays that even more. Okay, I'm about to pause in a second here and take some questions, but these are examples of the kinds of pathologies that you might see. So in the green, we have the kind of expected ideal, and this is a pattern that's seen in, it's called fixed acid pattern, and it's seen in people with chronic inflammation. One of the mechanisms by which the body can defend itself against alkaline stress is inflammatory acidification. And so if you're stuck with this on a 24/7 basis, this tends to be what you see. And this is not uncommon in our modern society, the age of inflammation. This is the jet lag pattern, and it's not that common, but it's something to look for if you or somebody that you know has this, everything's wrong all the time kind of lifestyle problems and feelings and performance issues where during the day they're not really that awake and that they have a kind of brain fog experience, and then at night they're kind of tossing and turning all night. This is a common pattern that you see for people manifesting those kinds of symptoms. The damp pattern is not that uncommon, and it's a warning sign. When Emmanuel Ravisi was studying cancer patients back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, he found that all of his cancer patients, that the damp pattern was the most common manifestation, and it was either shifted acid or shifted alkaline, depending upon what kind of cancer they had. And that predicted, that acid shift or alkaline shift predicted how they would respond to different kinds of pH balancing approaches or various kinds of therapeutics. And lastly, I'm going to illustrate the migraine pattern. And this one is especially interesting because it demonstrates that fixed acid pattern as an acute response rather than a chronic response. So the migraine pattern has this alkalinizing trend, which you see as the drop line here. And that's a point where at some point, as this gets deeper and deeper into the alkaline territory, as the pH rises higher and higher, at some point it crosses a line. And when it crosses a line, it's like the body freaks out. It says, this is too much alkalinity, and it invokes an inflammatory response, which is usually prostaglandin based. and that rapidly acidifies. And so you see this extreme pH. Now, in order to actually chart this, you would have to take your urine, you have to measure urine before and after this inflammatory process begins. But if you've got a migraine problem, then what you can do is test yourself and explore this region that's in pink here, or lavender, where there's a prodromal symptom that you usually can experience, where you're given a warning 5 to 30 minutes before the migraine that the migraine is coming. And people who study their urine pH can feel this and discriminate with it, and can, in this phase, abort their migraine. In other words, before the pH hits this threshold of severity and the body overreacts, at that point, you can emergency acidify yourself and avoid the migraine. But once that acidification starts, you now have this period where if you try to intervene, you make things worse. So some emergency acidification here would be therapeutic. Here, it would be worse. It would worsen the condition. Okay, so I'm going to stop it at this point before going on and open it up for questions, since I've laid quite a bit of groundwork. Are there any questions that are best answered now?
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
It's Chris. You mentioned that people I don't have migraines, but a friend does. Let's say that they need to do this urgent acidification. How do they do that? Just eating meat or something?
Or, for example, a fish oil supplement could be a rapid acidification intervention that somebody could do. Fish oil or evening primrose oil sublingually. Jan Johnson, who taught me a lot of this and wrote on it and practiced it for quite a long time with a number of people, she used popcorn. So she would carry around a baggie in her purse with a couple of kernels of popcorn in it. And she's allergic to corn. And so she would then expose herself to that allergic influence, and that would acidify her body, and it would abort the migraine. It would prevent the migraine. So it's not necessarily a graceful way to do it, but a brief allergic reaction may be better than, a day or two of migraine, depending upon how bad it is. And so for her, it was really worth it to have figured that out. But many of the supplements have acidifying effects, and depending upon how early they occur and how predictable they are, you can intervene with things like, for example, selenium, vitamin A. You might have some food that would be acidifying, like let's say aged meat, or maybe fried meat, or pretty much anything fried. Popcorn can acidify pretty much everybody. That's why it's used in movie theaters to keep you from falling asleep during a movie, is because it has a mild acidifying inflammatory effect from the corn oil, which when heated to high enough temperatures to cause the kernel to pop, actually forms a bit of corn oil peroxide, which is an inflammatory influence. So there's many different things that you can intervene with, and I don't know if any of them are necessarily qualified in terms of what works for the most number of people. So I think it's basically a trial and error process for anybody who's a migraine sufferer to figure it out. But part of the therapeutic approach is, if you realize that, that the migraines are telling you about the downside of extreme alkalinity, that this can also be related to a lifestyle of chronic alkalinity. In other words, you could be hypothyroid. You could have mercury or lead toxicity. You could have had a metabolic entrainment process when you were a child and had infectious mononucleosis. So a lot of these conditions that may alter the balance between diet and metabolism, where you've got, you know, a toxicity in the diet or a sabotage of your metabolism, and for some reason that you can't balance yourself easily, and therefore you need to focus at that more basic level to raise your metabolism overall, instead of just focusing on, you know, preventing a severe alkaline event.
That's fascinating. Steve, where will this video be posted later on?
Not sure. I'm probably going to post it on my YouTube channel, but at least what I can do is load it on my cloud account and provide a URL for people to access it, and you can post it wherever you want.
Great, thank you.
So asthma is the same kind of inflammatory condition. And so many different ways in which inflammation may be managed. And so, you know, nowadays I would talk about the potential application of this technology to spike protein reactions, that both COVID and the mRNA vaccines, pretty much all the vaccines, are all spike oriented, spike protein oriented. And it's a vascular inflammatory effect that could be acidifying your body. And the problem with a high amount of acidification is that the opposite kind of stress can occur. You can have a need for increased alkalinity that can then be, your body can deliver in the form of down-regulating your metabolism. You might have reverse T3 elevation, you might have adrenal compensation, you might have you know, entrainment, which I mentioned for mononucleosis, which is an alkaline stress. You may have acid entrainment, and I think, yeah, Chris, it was you that posted about what was going on with the tennis tournament and all kinds of people having problems with performance, and that can be a manifestation of that kind of chronic inflammation. As I've hinted at already, and I'll talk a little bit more about, is that the inflammation is a antagonist to sleep, an antagonist to healing. And so what happens if you're training is that you need to have enough alkalinity to recover from whatever abuse you're delivering to your body through training that would then raise your performance to a certain level, and then you recover from it, which makes you stronger. Well, if that recovery process is sabotaged by spike protein, or eating sausage, or being exposed to, let's say, aluminum or mercury, then you become entrained to have your metabolism lowered to a manageable level. And that can manifest in this day and age through spike protein, which is at this point in time still not assessed for that question of the time course of the spike protein influence. And so I think that what we're going to find is that SARS-CoV-2 is a much more efficient spike protein agent than natural beta coronaviruses, and that the vaccine technology that's used in the mRNA vaccines, it uses methyl pseudouridine instead of pseudouridine or just plain uridine, that provides a more sustainable spike protein production, which, while enhancing the production of antibodies to it, can also result in extended inflammation. And we call this post-COVID syndrome and post-vaccination syndrome. So at this point in time, given how recent this all is, there's a lot of a gap between knowledge and understanding. And so we just don't know enough.
Steve, can I ask a question here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. And I wanted to say thanks for this. It's really extremely well organized and very, very helpful. I really appreciate it. So my wife and I tend to be night owls, and so we eat a more acidifying breakfast, and we've been taking some either magnesium chloride or calcium chloride with breakfast to help with the acidification.
Mhm.
But then we find if we don't compensate for the chloride, we end up being acidic all night long. So our strategy has been to take a small amount of bicarbonate 30 minutes before dinner, because then it doesn't affect the acidity for the meal, but it starts to balance the chloride out. And we kind of tune that to get to 6.2 urine in the morning. And so that seems to work pretty well. Does that seem like a reasonable strategy, or would
Yeah,
you?
it does.
Okay.
You could also take your magnesium as magnesium thiosulfate.
Mhm.
And so the chloride anion is alkalinizing, but the thiosulfate anion is acidifying. So you get the acidification from the magnesium and the acidification from the thiosulfate, and it might allow you to take a lower dose overall.
Mhm.
And you know, if you happen to be thiol sensitive and stuff like that, maybe it might not work, but
Mhm.
that there's all kinds of other ways that you can take magnesium salts to avoid the chloride, like magnesium ascorbate and magnesium glycinate, and you know, this kind of thing. So there are ways to do that. But the idea that you're mentioning, which is one way to deal with what would be called a damped, you know, pH pattern, is
Mhm.
that you're pushing your acidification at the beginning of the day, and you're pushing your alkalinity at the end of the day, and helping to regulate your circadian rhythm to tune it to the actual day itself.
Yeah, pumping the swing instead of damping.
Yes. And so you're synchronizing it to the photo period and to your clocks and to your performance in your life. You know, that if you're leading meetings in the morning and you're you know, trying to calm down at the end of the day to unload all the stress and
Mhm.
and distress that would be caused by your daytime activities. That's a common thing that alcohol is used for. You know, people will have a glass of wine at the end of the day to turn things around. And not only is alcohol an alkalinizing influence, but it's also a relaxant. So you get tension during the day and you get relaxation at night. And you can do similar things with choline, for example, in the morning to increase your tension, and then maybe GABA or theanine or whatever at night, you know, if alcohol doesn't work, you know, because of hangover effects and inflammation from the acetaldehyde, you can then, you know, alkalinize by other means, or use something that would be a superfood along those lines, which would be, let's say, green algae or seaweed.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
vegetables are alkalinizing, green leafy vegetables are alkalinizing, and green leafy sea vegetables are even more alkalinizing. So that idea of circadian adjusted dosing of things is applicable across the spectrum in terms of what vitamins you take. You know, if something is acidifying, you take it in the morning. If it's alkalinizing, you take it at the end of the day. So good point.
Thanks.
So I have a question, Steve.
Yes, Jordan.
What minerals would you consider acidifying?
I
Because
have a chart.
I take a magnesium supplement, obviously, and I didn't hear whether or not that was acidifying or not.
It is, and calcium is acidifying as well. But there's also an electrolyte influence that seems to be different between type A and type B people. Some people will get a sedative effect from magnesium.
That seems to be me.
Okay, and they'll get a energizing effect from calcium.
Okay.
That that's the way they are, and so you need to know that you're one of those instead of the people the opposite, where magnesium energizes them and calcium sedates.
So basically, we just need to get a baseline of what's really going on to be able to figure this out.
Well, that's the biohacking approach to
Right.
pH balancing, is that you test to establish a baseline, and then you try an experiment and you look what happens to your urine pH pattern.
So naturally, that's a circadian rhythm, right? Where at night you're supposed to be alkaline, and then during the day you're supposed to be more acidic in general.
Mhm.
But it is dependent upon your diet, is what I'm understanding.
Well, your diet and your metabolism. I mean, they're all inputs into the system. I mean, it's a balance. You know, you've got a system that tends towards the alkaline because acid can be high, medium, or low, and the average pH is built for an average metabolism. So our bodies are designed to be homeostatic mechanisms. And so the issue is there a pathology? Is there something that's out of whack? And how can you identify it? And for some aspects, blood pH can be very normal and salivary pH can be abnormal. In other words, that there's a deeper level of the body that is creating acid, like, for example, lactic acidosis. So the
So would
body
you-
still has some degree of pH regulation in the blood, but deeper in the body, there's a pH imbalance that's being masked by the efficiency of your kidneys.
Would you recommend testing the saliva or the urine, or are they equal?
Well, the chart that I'm going to show you that Joni developed, and she has urine, saliva, and ketones all on the same chart.
Okay.
That gives you the ability to do both if you want to. And there's the pH range, because saliva is more alkaline. The pH strips that go from 4.5 to 8.5 instead of 7.5 can also do saliva. So you can use the same papers. But keep in mind that these paper indicators, I'm going to go through that a little bit later in the presentation about actually how to do it. But keep in mind that these indicators, they're not biologically friendly. These are chemicals that you would not want to ingest. So if you're doing saliva pH, it doesn't mean that you stick the paper in your mouth.
Okay, I understand. Yep.
So what I do is, spit on my palm, or spit on in the sink, or spit on a cup, and then touch it to the pH paper to get a reading, so that the chemicals never get into my body.
So one other quick question. Thank you for that. So I did test my urine. It was probably in the evening sometime, probably 7 or 8 o'clock, and it was around 8.5. So I'm just a little curious, is that too alkaline?
Well, it is extreme, but there's one case of a woman who had a pH of 10,
Okay.
urine pH of 10. Now, she was in really, really bad shape. So, but if you're feeling good and all that, I would say no. I mean, just because urine on average swings 2 full pH units in 24 hours doesn't mean that 3 is pathological at all.
Okay. Okay.
So it may be the case that if this were studied on a wholesale level, that the bigger your swing, the better. But it's like, having any kind of rhythm. You've got highs and you've got lows. You've got bass and treble. You've got, acid and alkali. And so if you have alkali showing up at night, that's a good thing. But if you don't have acid showing up during the day, then there's a problem.
Yeah, which I haven't tested. So you're saying if I show up acid, really, really acid in the morning, and I wanted to kind of shift that circadian rhythm, I could eat alkaline in the morning to kind of shift the circadian rhythm in a way?
Yeah. I mean,
Because I literally fall asleep sometimes 8:30, 9 o'clock, which is way too dang early. But I don't like to. Yeah, I don't like to miss the window. That's when I fall asleep, and so
okay.
I'm
So
way off.
you're a lark.
Yeah, I'm up early, but I go to bed early.
Yeah, exactly. So you're a lark tendency. So for you, if that issue of going to sleep at 9 and then going to sleep at 8:45 and then going to sleep at 8:30 and then 8:20 and 8:10
Yeah.
at night after night, that tendency gets in your way, then you'd probably do very well with an alkalinizing breakfast.
I'm gonna try it. I think that's very interesting. I've tried the
So
light
in that
acid.
situation, if you're in a ketone-based diet, and you want to break your ketosis, you wouldn't want to do that right before you go to sleep at night. You'd want to do it for breakfast and just have fruit for breakfast. And it could be that you just do it every 3 days.
And that's a question, is ketosis acidic or is your urine going to be alkaline
It's
in
not.
the night?
No, energy, it is acidic on a low level because it is increasing your energy.
Oh yeah,
Most
definitely.
people, yeah, when they go into ketosis, their energy pathways become more efficient and they generate more carbon dioxide, which is an acidic influence. But it's not like acidic as you would experience with, let's say, ketoacidosis, which is just off the charts.
That's extreme ketosis, right?
That's right. And
Right.
it's also a dysfunctional ketosis. There's a breakdown in the normal ketotic process, and you're generating ketones that you're not actually able to utilize.
Understood. I think those were all my questions. Thank you.
Well, some of them I'll address in the next few slides, but I wanted to stop now just because, you know, it's a lot to assume, and some people may have some degree of sophistication with aspects of this, and other people it may be just cold turkey for them.
Yeah, this is cold turkey for me, so.
Anybody else, or should I go on now?
Steve, you did mention the inflammatory aspects of the vaccines, and I know it's a sensitive subject, but does that inflammation dissipate on its own, or does it need something to get it out?
Well, if you're exposed to spike protein 24/7, it's going to be constant. So, you know, our experience with natural beta coronaviruses is that they're like a cold or like a flu. You go through a phase when you have inflammation, your body temperature goes up, you run a fever, your body clears the infection, and then it goes away. But then you've got people who have chronic viral problems. CMV, Epstein-Barr, herpes. A lot of these kinds of lipid viruses are sleepers. You know, they hang out in your body, and if you're healthy and you're lucky, they're just dormant for your entire life. And the only time they're visible is right when you're dying, or at autopsy. After you've been dead, the virus wakes up and starts to replicate. And so they found that most people with Alzheimer's disease, for example, on autopsy will show herpes viral titers in their brain. And this has prompted some people to mistakenly, you know, conclude that herpes causes Alzheimer's disease, when I think it's the other way around, that Alzheimer's disease causes herpes. And so we're seeing, for example, shingles as a manifestation of both vaccination and COVID, and largely it's being seen in as a post-vaccination syndrome. And I don't know if that's basically low metabolism susceptibility factors that would normally drive shingles for elders. You know, our metabolism is dropping, you know, as we get older. And at some point that results in your pH going more and more towards alkaline values, and viruses love alkalinity. And so it's common to see shingles outbreaks in the elderly. And it just so happens that it seems to be worse if you're vaccinated. It seems like it's kind of like almost expected. And that could be through toll-like receptors, or it could just be through a inflammatory mediated downregulation of your energy pathways. So I don't know, but I think it's a really good question you're asking. Okay. Okay, so this is where I left it. So this is the mechanical part. You know, what do you do? Okay, so it's every time you pee. the idea is that you need to see the rhythm, and you need to be able to separate the tidal forces from acute forces. And so if you're having a migraine attack, you don't want that to interfere with your urine measurements to see if you have a circadian rhythm. And in order to see this, it's anywhere from 2 days to maybe a week to figure out what your pattern is. And so if you do day 1 and then you do day 2 and you superimpose them, if they match and they're basically identical, then you're basically done. You've now assessed your rhythm and you've got predictability. Sorry about that. That was unintentional. But if you have, for example, jet lag syndrome, your readings are going to tend to be all over the map. And it may be very difficult for you to see an overall pattern because you have different times of the day when you may have an alkaline momentum and compensation mechanisms based on exercise or things like that. They may not be consistent enough for you to see a pattern. And if you get to, let's say, 7 days and you don't see a pattern, that's when you should talk to me. And it's also when I would suggest that you stop. I mean, sequential urine pH testing it's a pain in the butt. I mean, not literally, but it's difficult. It takes dedication and attention. You know, if you wake up in the middle of the night, you have to have your pH paper sitting right there on the toilet so that you don't forget to take your urine pH at that particular point in time. And if you run off to the hardware store or you go to a meeting and you have forgotten your pH papers, you know, you're missing that data point, and that will decrease the detail of your assessment. So for me, it takes 2 rolls. I have 1 roll of pH papers in my pocket, my work pants, and I have 1 roll that sits on my toilet. So you work that out, you know, and the subconscious urge to blow it off is not to be minimalized. I mean, it sneaks up on everybody. It's such an invasive kind of intervention. And so what I say is you do it intensely while you do it, and then you don't do it at all. That you oscillate between doing it and not doing it. And so you may just say, well, I'm just going to do this, you know, once a month, and say, okay, so this month, what am I going to test? And so you do, you know, 2 or 3 days, and then you take a supplement, you do a procedure, you get a fecal implant, you get hydrogen peroxide therapy, you start, you know, emeramide, whatever it is that you do, and then you measure yourself for the next 3 days as well. So you have a before and after bracket for whatever your intervention is. And that way, you know, it's intense when you're doing it. And then when you're not doing it, your subconscious mind can relax and go, okay, that's over with. You know, it's not like this massive obligation that prevents you from enjoying life. The 2 different papers that I use, catalog number 334 is from 4.5 to 7.5, which is 1.5 pH units on either side of average. So that gives you pretty good data, but it's specifically balanced for urine and not for saliva. The catalog 2210 is from 4.5 to 8.5, which covers the saliva range as well. And it's not that you necessarily need a wider range. So, you know, if you pin it at 4.5 or you pin it at 8.5, that still gives you all the data you need for measuring the rhythm and the swing. You just, you don't know if it's at 8.5, you don't know if it's 8.7, 8.9, 9, you know, but that tends to be so rare as to not be important. Microessential Laboratories is a great source for getting these nice chemical standard devices instead of medical devices. So tearing off the strip, if you can see on the picture there, there's a plastic cutter sticking off the roll, and you just pull out some of the paper and tear it off. So now you've got this piece of paper in your fingers, and you touch it to this stream of urine. You touch the fresh end, so you grabbed it. So the end that you grab has got your fingerprint on it, some finger oils on it, and all of that. And you don't want your skin pH to get in the way of the reading. So you touch the other end, the freshly cut end. It's been inside the dispenser, is now outside the dispenser. You just touch it to the stream of urine. A quarter of a second, just touch it. And then you match up the color, and then you log it. Okay. Plot it on a chart and connect the dots, and this is what it looks like. This is a modification of my design, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is organized to make it easy. This is a one-day chart, and you can see on the left is where you graph your pH data, starting in the morning and going all the way through the night. There's dashed lines as well that at the bottom that show where you can graph your ketones. And so you could do this with X's and O's, where O is a pH reading of your saliva and X's is a ketone reading. You could also have a different symbol for your salivary pH. You could use different colors. You have, 3 pens, green, red, and blue, and each one of them tracks a different thing, whatever you want to do. The next column over, it says feel, and that's basically a simple 1 through 5 kind of judgment. Do you feel really good, really bad, or somewhere in the middle? And that's just a check mark that allows you to not have to do a journal entry. And in the space to the right of that, you've got activity, symptoms, environment, and food, some of which you may want to track, some of which you may not want to track. And having the dashed line just allows you to scan the data to track symptoms independently of your environment or your food, that kind of thing. To the far right, you have these, what I call check columns. So number 1 could be coffee. So you put a check mark when you have a cup of coffee. So if you wake up in the morning, you have 2 cups of coffee, you put 2 check marks there. If you have a coffee break at 10 a.m., you put a check mark there. It allows you to reduce tracking something to a simple yes or no answer, or rate it from a 1 to 5 scale. So if you have, let's say, bursitis and your shoulder aches, you can just write down shoulder in one of the columns, and then you put a 1 if it's trivial, or a 5 if it's severe. And so this allows you to track repetitive things fairly efficiently. So in the chat, I have a link to this particular document where you can download it and print as many copies as you want. This is my favorite way of collecting data. So this is where you might figure out that eating goji berries is really bad for you. You notice that you become very, very acidic when you eat goji berries, even if you have them for breakfast or for dinner.
Hey, Steve,
Yes.
I don't see the link in the chat.
Oh, but you might have joined the meeting after I posted, but I'll post it again. As a matter of fact, I can do that as soon as I'm not screen sharing. Okay, so let me stop. We'll come back to this in a second. There it is. Okay, see that? Google.com link.
Yes, I see it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so you can save the chat at any time and keep track of all of those, whatever links get put in this as well. So any questions now before I move on? Okay. Okay, so this is the strategy part of, using urine pH as a diagnostic or therapy technique. So the first part of it is the biofeedback part, where you may be able to learn about why you feel certain ways. So do you feel differently when you're acid versus alkaline? Okay, so that's a real basic kind of assessment to do. And is it the magnitude of the swing? So do you feel different when it's at, close to 4.5 as opposed to 5.5? So that can make a big difference. And remember, I was talking about migraine headaches as being an alkaline threshold effect. So, here, do you feel differently when you have alkaline effect in the afternoon as opposed to a deep alkaline effect at night? Or you have momentum sensitivity. In other words, you feel when you're going acid or you are going alkaline. The momentum issue. So some people feel one and not the other. So I just suggest that you consider both. And also in terms of whether or not those momentum effects are in tune with the circadian rhythm versus out of tune. So in these two situations, you've got in the morning, you've got an alkalinizing effect taking place when you're normally supposed to be acidifying. And here you've got an acidifying effect at night when you're supposed to be alkalinizing. And that can make a difference. So you can see if you can identify any one of these trends. So circadian rhythms, pH, and sleep are all tied together. And it's essential. It dates back to the earliest animals, and even animals that don't have central nervous systems have have sleep phases where they are unresponsive, even though they don't have a central nervous system. Urine shows the pH stresses to the blood, and they're involved in driving your O2 and CO2 mechanism. You need to measure your pH readings sequentially, as opposed to, for example, single point measurements, which is often talked about by different people. They say your first urination of the day should be this, and your second urination of the day should be that, and in the afternoon you should be this. And all of that can be grossly misleading. The more detail you get, the better. One, drink water, of course, pee more often. And also you can pee at your convenience rather than when your bladder gets full. So this is something I've been saying for 40 years, that sleeping problems are common to many pathologies, and they often show up before the primary symptoms of the pathology do. So I've got two more slides that are more advanced, but this is a good stopping point to ask if we have any questions.
Yeah, I do have a question, Steve.
Uh-huh.
Where do heavy metals play a role in this in regards to pH? Because what's unique about this, or what's interesting about this whole situation with me, is this happened right after I had 9 amalgam fillings removed. So I don't know if it's directly correlated, but I'm just curious.
No, come on now, it's correlated.
Well, I believe it is based on my hair test. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a temporal connection is very, very important, and it's one of the ways we make connections between things. And the problem is that if you have an event and then your response to that event is a month later, you may not make the connection. I think that's what's going on with vaccination.
Yeah, mine was immediate. I mean, as soon as I got those fillings removed, there was no sleep for 4 to 5 months. And it's just now where I'm starting to get back on track, but it's still fragmented in a sense. And
Yes.
also the circadian rhythm in my mind is shifted in a sense.
Yeah, well, your conscious mind may have doubts, but your subconscious mind knows.
Right.
So let me point out that heavy metals have an elemental acidifying or alkalizing effect.
Gotcha.
So it turns out that lead and mercury, it's opposite. Lead is acidifying, mercury is alkalizing. And so what was interesting is that if you go back 200 plus years to medicine in Great Britain at the time of Mad Hatters, mercury was used as an antidote for lead poisoning. And vice versa. Lead was used as an antidote for mercury poisoning. So there's a way in which heavy metal burdens may be balanced. If you've got just the right amount of lead and just the right amount of mercury, you may be totally asymptomatic in ways that lower levels that are out of balance might be symptomatic. So that's just a weird aspect of things that does nothing but complicate your job of figuring out what's going on.
Oh yeah, it's been a year and a half.
But both lead and mercury sabotage your energy systems.
I know that firsthand. Yep.
Yep. So that is in general an alkalizing effect overall. So pretty much any toxin is likely to be alkalizing if it's not inflammatory. So if you're reacting to, let's say, solanaceous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, nightshade vegetables. No, cruciferous vegetables, sorry. If you're
broccoli,
reacting to
yep.
cruciferous vegetables, that's an anti-thyroid influence. That chemical that's found in those vegetables interferes with thyroid hormone and metabolic rate.
Are you talking about sulforaphane?
Yes.
Yep.
And so that's a direct energy effect. So that's alkalizing by being an anti-thyroid influence. But if you look at the solanaceous vegetables like potatoes and tomatoes and goji berries and red and green peppers and eggplant, that's a toxin that may not manifest at all through a change in your energy and might be inflammatory. So you'd have an acidification effect from the allergic reaction to that particular food. So alkalizing foods can produce acidity based on an allergy reaction or based on an allergy defense mechanism. If the alkalinity is too strong, you can get the inflammatory effect of the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes and other kinds of oxygen reactive, oxygen sensing system in the human body. And that's not respiratory, by the way. Your body does not pay any attention to oxygen for your breathing. It's all carbon dioxide related. But there is an oxygen sensing system, but it's for regulating inflammation and defense against scrapes and cuts and burns and other tissue traumas.
All right, thank you for that.
Earl.
I'm a mature 88 and a half, and I have my urine every 2 to 4 hours. So I don't want to do that all the time. So about every,
Just do it all the time for 2 days.
3 times during the night?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, sir. I'll obey.
Yeah, so just look at it like taking a vacation or assembling some IKEA furniture. It's a short time, painful event, but it's going to be over with.
Steve, you mentioned the sleep disturbances lead to various pathologies. Are they just too numerous to name, or what's some of the top categories, if there are?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't know of an exemption. You've got cardiovascular disease. You're going to have sleep problems that were showing up before you get your diagnosis. You got autoimmune disease. You're going to get your sleep problems before your diagnosis. I mean, I mean, I suppose there could be an example where you might have, well, I can't think of one. I mean, certainly breaking your leg isn't going to show up as a sleep problem before you break your leg. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here's contact information for me. I'll bring this back up later, but I'm going to skip it now to go on to these. Oh, I didn't know they were actual links. Okay, here we go. Next one. Okay. So an issue of why do we sleep? Why do we have a pH rhythm? I'm just coming up with my ideas, my insights into it. And one of them is that oscillating systems are more stable fundamentally. And they're able to maintain long-term homeostasis better than damp systems. That's true in electronics, and it's true in biology. Also, that the two-state polarity of being awake and asleep allows us to optimize them. And I think that this is for survival values in general, that you're able to optimize for different circumstances that give the overall chances of genetic passing on your genes to your next generation more likely. And so for being awake, you've got your energy, mobility, your speed, and your immunity, all playing a role in your competition survival. And for sleep, that's where we do the repair and growth and protein synthesis. In human babies, when they were measured, they found that, you know, their length, you know, lying down in a bed, measuring how tall they are sideways, that they find that they were the same height for several nights in a row, and all of a sudden they're 1/4 of an inch bigger. And that all happens overnight. So that growth phase and the repair phase are all involved in protein synthesis. And it makes sense that that takes place at a different time than eating and moving and climbing trees and outrunning bears and things like that. And for the brain, there's a reinitialization of sensitivity that takes place. In a sense, it's a reboot. And it's like turning off a computer and turning it back on again. Well, while we're sleeping in different phases of sleep, our brains become unresponsive to stimuli, and there's a very slow wave kind of sleep that kind of reestablishes a baseline that allows the brain to function better the next day. There's another aspect of pH defense too that has to do with the levels of the body. Each compartment that is separated by a membrane has its own pH defense, its own pH. And so you can find things like lysosomes in the cellular organelle level that are extremely acidic inside. And you have different pHs in your cytoplasm as opposed to your nucleus or your mitochondria. So how this plays a role is that higher levels, having evolved later, defend the lower levels. And the perfect example of that is edema. You have cellular dehydration, which induces tissue overhydration. So the tissue is trying to force water into the dehydrated cells. This is not uncommon at all. When this happens in Alzheimer's disease, many neurologists think that it's because you have neurons that have died, and it's actually just the fact that your brain is dehydrated. And so the way you know that is that if you give somebody thyroid hormone, their brain swells back up to normal size in a day or two. And so that's certainly not from brain neural regeneration. Life also evolved in layers. And so our original evolution as single cell organisms, that all took place in an anaerobic alkaline environment. So antioxidant defenses were based on the redox active elements that were common at the time, which were iron and manganese. So if you look at superoxide dismutase at that cellular level, it is based on manganese. And iron is the key electron transfer agent in mitochondria. The antioxidant defense system was based on sulfur, lots of sulfur around in that reduced environment. Sulfide and sulfhydryl compounds were present and plentiful. And so the body developed that as a pool with the use of glutathione, whereas the newer life forms, all the multicellular life forms, they developed in an acidic, oxygen atmosphere, and the iron and manganese became scarce, and so we shifted to copper and zinc. So the cellular, so mitochondrial SOD is manganese based, and cellular superoxide dismutase is copper and zinc based. But the redox buffering system, being foundational, remained unchanged. Okay. Questions? I'm going to leave this up for a minute in case somebody wants to write something down or do a screen grab. Brian, I can tell you're on the phone because you do a 90-degree shift every once in a while.
This is Jackie. I was wondering if you know what NBMI does to the pH.
No,
How about
but I know enough people who are taking it, and but I didn't do pH testing when I took it, so
Okay.
I've not verified
don't know.
that at all. But sulfhydryl compounds are acidifying, and removing mercury could easily be acidifying, but recompartmentalization of mercury could be alkalinizing. So great question.
But if you're removing lead,
Same
then that
thing.
could be alkalizing, right?
Well, the lead toxicity is probably alkalinizing, and the lead
Oh,
native effect as an element would be acidifying.
okay.
Yeah.
So if you're removing it, what are you alkalizing or?
Well, I think that it would be clear that you would be alkalizing at the level of lead's native ability, native location.
Okay.
So as you move from the top of the periodic table down the periodic table,
Mhm.
the level of the accumulating nutrient goes deeper and deeper into the body. So if you get beryllium poisoning, for example, that's very superficial. And if you get, let's say, copper or nickel toxicity, that would be at the cellular level. You go down to lead, you're now sub-nuclear. You're accumulating lead and mercury in your genes and in your mitochondrial compartments.
Okay.
And so those pH, that could be changed there, and you wouldn't measure it, you wouldn't see it in your urine, because your urine is very superficial. This is where sodium would be located, would be in your blood, and potassium would be in your cells. So going from sodium down, magnesium in your blood and calcium in your cells. And this is what you see when you start looking at these compartments. If you look at, for example, serum potassium, you're measuring that 10% of the potassium that's in your blood and ignoring the 90% that's in your cells.
Okay. So I'm curious about this for, of course, a reason. I haven't measured, but my husband, who has had a number of pain syndromes, had a pain syndrome in his ankle that was diagnosed as a bone spur that kind of affected the whatever that tendon is at the back of your leg. Anyway, and I made up a arnica DMSO NBMI cream for him to put on there. And it just turned out that over a period of time, now, he's not had surgery. He hasn't demobilized the ankle because that's what they said to do for the tendon. But over a period of time of using that, the quote unquote problem appears to be gone. And he has a similar problem on one of his knees, on the other leg. And so I've started having him use the cream on the knee, and he's starting to report improvements on the knee now. And so I'm wondering, from what you're presenting, because I don't really know how to think about this in terms of necessarily like we're detoxing the joint. But I'm wondering if what it's doing is it's changing the acid alkaline balance that's there, and that somehow is reducing the inflammation, and that somehow is improving his experience of that area.
It could be. I don't know how you would distinguish between a pH change at the tissue level that you can't measure
Yeah.
to let's say, a nutrient repletion process or an antitoxin process.
Okay.
I mean, they could all be accounting for what you're seeing.
Right.
And I mean, I would say that if I'm looking at somebody with copper, for example, transdermal copper in a knee, I would try to ask a question relating to their overall collagen quality issues. So the collagen quality in a ligament or a tendon may be related to the collagen quality in a tissue.
Yes.
And so are they bruisable, for example? If you knuckle them so that they get pain, and a few minutes later the pain is gone. So the trauma of the knuckling is minor.
Right.
And they do get a bruise or don't get a bruise, that gives you a clue as to what may be going on with that. And so, without sequential urine pH testing or saliva testing, you really don't have a good pH insight into what's going on in tissues.
Okay.
But with that kind of measurement, you now can qualify the copper component from acid or alkaline component, which might play a big role, for example, in osteoporosis or osteopenia.
Okay. So for him, how would I set up? So we'll do this test together, but for him, would I have him stop doing everything and
I
test?
wouldn't.
You would.
That's common advice in the medical community. You're going to get an organic acid test. Stop taking drugs and stop taking your supplements.
Well, right. Yeah.
They'll tell you that, but the problem is that the withdrawal process is going to mess with the test results more than continuing what you're doing.
Okay. Okay. All right.
And also, free life is about, whatever is going on with you at the time.
Yeah, I
free
know.
living.
I know.
And so
Yeah.
when you make a measurement, in the context of your real life, then when you change something, that's what you're measuring. And
Okay.
if you've gone off all your supplements and you test yourself, you can't then infer anything from a subsequent test based on some change.
Right. Well, we try not to do too many supplements. So that's my own strategy.
But that's part of what you can see
Yeah.
when you do urine pH testing. So if you do urine pH testing, taking calcium in the morning and magnesium before bed at night, and then, you take a week off and then the next week you reverse them, you now have a way of assessing, through
What
your
it's
body,
doing.
whether or not you're a night owl or a morning lark, or whether you're a type A or type B personality. You now have you're now speaking your body's language,
Right.
rather than expecting it to understand English.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Good question. Earl.
The chart where you had the different measurement devices, could you display that again?
Yeah.
I missed that.
You mean the pH papers?
pH, yes.
Okay, let me do this and, oops, I gotta share my screen first. Share screen, there, share, and then maximize, okay. Is that what you wanted?
Yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
So for Micro Essential, but it's doesn't have to be a particular brand. You know, if you live in a different country where Micro Essential doesn't ship or something like that, you just need that range, 4.5 to 7.5. If it's 4.0 to 8.0, that's fine. You just need to have the range being on either side of 6, and you need to have colors that you can see. Now, if you're red green colorblind, you may not be able to see this. You may have to use something else. So, you know, but you know, as long as you're measuring that range, and maybe, you know, either side of 6, well, maybe it's either side of 7 for saliva. So you might be able to find something that goes from pink to red to brown that would be just as useful for saliva, because, well, I guess if it's red, you're still red green colorblind.
Hey, Steve,
Uh-huh.
I seem to recall that you're supposed to wait a certain number of seconds after taking the measurement. Was it 15 seconds or 10 seconds?
A lot of them will say that, but for urine pH, I mean, it's like 99.9% of the color change is done in 5 seconds. So by the time you get out your pen to write it down, or when you pull the paper up to match it to the chart, the color change is done. It's very, very rapid. Now, for measuring ketones, you need longer time frame, and in measuring redox potential, you need the longer time frame. So if you're doing vitamin C measurements using urine sticks, urine test strips, you need to wait at least probably 10 seconds to see the full change. Redox reactions are slow by comparison to pH changes. Protons transfer, you know, in femtoseconds.
Do I buy the papers in a drugstore, or do I have to order someplace? And if so, where?
Well, if you're buying them in a drugstore, I think you may need a prescription. Those are called nitrazine test papers. That's the chemical that's used. But the difference between quality for chemistry purposes and for medical purposes, there isn't any difference. The quality demands and performance demands are the same.
Should I buy them at Amazon?
Yeah, that's a good place.
Okay.
You can go directly to the Micro Essential Laboratories website. There are also places that buy the Micro Essential Laboratory stuff wholesale and then sell it retail. So just keep in mind that it has to be the right range. So Micro Essential actually sells a pH test strip that they say is for urine, but it doesn't measure 4.5. So I don't like it. But so if you search and you see one from them that says urine testing, and it starts with 5 or 5.5, I think it's 5.5, you're missing out on the acid range, the acid detection capacity. And so I don't know why they say it's suitable for urine, because the nitrazine test paper measures 4.5 to 7.5, and that's exactly straddling the 6.0 to 6.2 mean urine pH.
Thank you.
I do have another question, Steve, here.
Good.
So when I exercise, I notice I don't sleep at all, really, it seems. So you said exercise is definitely acidifying, right?
Yes, but there is an alkaline rebound after exercise that takes place. So, you know, you can think of the pH systems as elastic. And if you push acidity, your body pushes back with alkalinity.
Now, can you go too alkaline where it would cause sleep
Yes.
disruptions?
Sure. I don't
Okay.
know. I certainly know that that would be like the migraine pattern.
Because it's inflammatory.
Yes. And
Yeah, so if I exercise before 12 p.m., I'm usually good. Any time after 12 p.m., you can forget it. Just very interesting. So that's why this pH is.
well, I've had many people tell me that many of their nighttime sleep pathologies resolve when they take a small amount of thyroid before they go to bed at night.
Really?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? A small amount of thyroid?
Well, quarter of a grain. I know one person who just told me they took half a grain, and AFib problem went away
Really?
overnight, gone.
Hmm.
And so I think that there's a lot of sleep pathologies that take place for hypometabolism based on two different reasons. One is just this alkaline stress issue, but the other one is adrenal compensation for inadequate thyroid influence. And
Oh,
so
okay.
because you're supposed to be alkaline at nighttime when you're sleeping, that any natural tendency you have, if your whole pattern shifts more towards alkaline, you can become too alkaline at night and have your inflammatory response activated. Just
Where the
like you
adrenals
would for
kick
a
in?
migraine.
Like where the adrenals would kick in?
Yes.
Okay.
And the adrenals are already kicking in at night. Dark adaptation stress is characterized by a steady increase in cortisol. That's natural and everybody does that. I mean, it's just, that's the way it works. But if your adrenal gland crosstalks between the medulla and the cortex, and you get adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine, that's antagonistic to sleep, totally.
Absolutely. So would you consider shaking, like waking up with like almost like the shakes? Would that be like an adrenaline release or a cortisol release? Or
I would
both?
say it might depend on your experience of it. So when I ask people about that kind of issue, I ask them, well, when you wake up, is your experience edgy, nervous, anxious?
Yes.
There's that kind of quality to your experience? Or are you perfectly comfortable and peaceful? And so cortisol would be comfortable and peaceful, and the epinephrine and norepinephrine would be edgy.
Yep,
And
that's me. That's interesting. So I'm getting some sort of adrenaline release in the middle of the night, which is very interesting.
so it's compensating for your excessive alkalinity.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question
So
is,
so how would one biohack excessive alkalinity?
well, metabolic pathways, thyroid hormone, for example, you could do a thyroid trial. You could also take something, supplement, before you go to sleep at night that would provide an extended acidification influence.
Okay.
Hopefully that wouldn't be inflammatory.
Right. Right. All right. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So, when Ravisi studied these things, and by the way, the book, the BHT book, which is available on the Steve page of Project Wellbeing, and the Natural Antiviral Self-Defense book, which is also free on the same page, those have charts where it lists acidifying and alkalinizing influences side by side that are foods, vitamins, minerals, drugs, etc.
Perfect. I can reference that book.
Yeah. And so you can just pick something on one side or the other. So fatty acids, for example, would be generally acidifying.
You're talking about
cholesterol would be
like a cod liver oil or something?
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Vitamin A.
Vitamin A. Okay.
But keep in mind that the overall problem, if it's over alkalinization generally, is that interventions to prevent alkalinization may themselves interfere with your sleep process.
Well, it seems I have a tough issue to work on here.
No, you do. And so the question is it just something that happens at night, or is it something that happens all the time? If it's just happening at night, interventions like that can be episodic. But if you're alkaline all the time, too alkaline, like let's say your acid peak during the day is only 5.5. So you're half a pH unit into the acid and you're 2 pH units into the alkaline. That's not balance.
So you want to be more acidic than that during the day.
You want to have an average pH of roughly 6.
I haven't checked it during the day. I'll definitely check it. My pH strips are these Enzymatica. They go to 5.5 to 8. So I'll just try this.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the classic pattern. 5.5 is not very acidic though.
So I should probably get those other ones. I took a snippet of those.
Well, if you're
of that.
pinning it at 5.5, that would be good evidence that you're generating some acidity. But then you get a wider range. So that's a
Yeah.
general rule when you're doing pH testing. If you pin it at the top end or the bottom end, you need to expand the range.
Exactly. I agree.
Okay, here's a question from Ian in the chat. How would somebody who is thiol sensitive, can't use NAC and glutathione, be able to enhance, unblock their methylation pathways? Well, there's basically 2 different subjects. One of them is the sulfhydryl system, which is based on redox control, and methylation, which is the category of management of methyl group transfers. And I don't know how those would be necessarily linked. I know that glycine is part of glutathione, and glycine is part of the methylation system. And so it could be that, something like collagen protein would be a source of glycine and might help both circumstances. But on the whole, I would look to, let's say, vitamin C as a possible alternative to glutathione supplementation, where you're dealing with the redox potential in the tissue instead of the cell, and detoxification. So, for example, do you have also, let's say, a intolerance of cilantro, for example, which would be oriented towards relocating your mercury, like thiols would tend to, and looking at thiosulfate as another sulfhydryl compound. Do you react badly to that? Yeah, I've had some people who weren't thiol insensitive, who thought they were because their doctor said that they're allergic to sulfa drugs, SULFA. And so they just assumed that sulfa and sulfur were the same thing. Methylation pathways also, I would look at things like choline and dimethylglycine and trimethylglycine as routes for passive and active methyl groups. So trimethylglycine can donate a methyl group actively, like B12 folic acid complex does. And so that's very inexpensive and fairly well tolerated. I mean, trimethylglycine is actually sweet to the tongue. Okay, I think that's answered all the questions. Let me open it up for last minutes. Anybody who hasn't asked a question yet, or somebody who's not up to here. Okay. Thank you for all this. It's been fun, and I will figure out what to do with this recording at some point.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stephen. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Steve. It was great.
Thank you.
Good.